We're in for something special today. It's a Minis Forum mini PC, but this is not just any mini PC. It's a 6900HX, which is actually a mobile processor. It's DDR5, and it has RDNA 2. So there's actually a lot to learn here with DDR5 and Infinity Fabric. It may actually help us solve some mysteries around Infinity Fabric and DDR5 with desktop AM5 CPUs, as it turns out. But that'll be later. For now, I want to show you this because this is really hotly anticipated. This has probably become my favorite home theater, like media center PC streaming because of the RDNA and everything else. Let's dive in and take a look. All right, first up, it's a mini computer. Let's take it out of the box. It's from Minis Forum. We've reviewed several things from Minis Forum. In the box, you've got a quick start manual and some other stuff. You can buy this with memory. You can buy this without memory as a bare bones kit. DDR5 4800 is what it's spec'd for. We got to talk about the BIOS. There's some rough edges. It's not Minis Forum's fault. I'll talk you through it. It's fine. There's just some things you need to know. But yeah, you can buy this as a bare bones or with an SSD and a pre-installed operating system. If you're not into installing your operating system, like if I said you need to make a Windows 11 installer USB and then copy drivers to the installer USB using another computer so that you can have working Ethernet and Wi-Fi, and that intimidates you, then you probably should just order the version that comes with memory and storage, because then everything will be pre-installed. So in the box, you get your machine, and this is actually physically pretty much identical, if not exactly identical, to the 560, I think it was, that I reviewed before. But remember, mobile processor, dual HDMI. Well, let's take a look at the ports. At the rear, we've got our 19 volt input. There is a 120 watt power brick in the box. Yes, 120 watts, although I never saw 120 watts at the wall with our power meter. We'll talk more about that in a minute. 2.5 gigabit Ethernet LAN. Dual stacks of 5 gigabit USB 3 at the back here, so that's a total of 4 ports, 2 HDMI ports. At the front, we have a port that is labeled USB 4. Spoiler alert. I have this Cooler Master Thunderbolt enclosure, which has a recent Thunderbolt chip. This is actually, I think, the latest Maple Ridge chipset in here, and it works perfectly. What? Yeah, USB 4, a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. Technically, more or less, is PCI Express over this, Type C connector. And so you can add external PCI Express devices via your Type C cable. So if you want to run an eGPU with this system, you totally can. And then you have more power budget for your CPU. That's a thing? Yeah, that's a thing. And it mostly works pretty much okay with this. AMD's got to work on their drivers when it comes to Thunderbolt enclosures. The 6000 and 7000 series GPUs is a little hit and miss, and that is maybe down to the BIOS on this thing. I could get it to work with fiddling with it, but be aware that you may have to fiddle with it. However, a 3060 in this enclosure and a 2070 were no problem. They were plug and play. It works for a fresh boot up as well as a hot plug installation. So just bear that in mind if you are going to do the eGPU thing. If you're interested enough in that, maybe I'll put the Thunderbolt stuff in another video, but know that it does work. Although it's not, advertised as Thunderbolt, because Thunderbolt has to be certified by Intel, and this being an AMD solution, they're never going to call it Thunderbolt, but it does work. See also the Wikipedia entry for Thunderbolt. Thank you, anonymous editor. Oh yeah, in the box. Power brick. Power cable. A stand. I won't stand for this. A tiny HDMI cable so you can mount it on the back of your display. A VESA mounting thing so you can mount it on the back of your display. An adapter cable. This is so you can use a 2.5 SATA drive with your Minis Forum. And an extra set of rubber feet. Why do you need an extra set of rubber feet? Well, that's the same as the 560. You got to peel off the rubber feet. Sometimes the adhesive comes with the rubber feet, sometimes not. So you got to be careful. I was able to very carefully basically just use my heat gun and heat this up a little bit and get it to peel off, but your mileage may vary. Well, let's talk about power and thermals. So for our power testing, we're using a kilowatt plug-in watt meter. It is here somewhere. And at idle, on the Windows desktop, this thing uses under 10 watts. It was 9 watts in most scenarios. That's pretty crazy. At full load, with CPU, the CPU and the GPU loaded artificially, the thing was using almost, but not quite, 90 watts. And that's the thing we really need to talk about. Because in the BIOS is a little bare bones. We'll talk more about that later. But the BIOS will let you configure the TDP of the CPU. The 6900HX, strictly speaking, is a 45 watt CPU. But the BIOS does give you the option to take it up to 65 watts. That is an overclock, really, sort of, kind of technically. But this BIOS doesn't rise to the level of like gamer enthusiasm. There's nothing to load an XMP profile. There's nothing to really do that kind of gamer stuff or the overclock stuff that you might expect from a normal desktop machine. This is a laptop part. It's not meant for the desktop. We are using it in a non-laptop scenario. And so when I went down the rabbit hole with the whole 65 watt CPU thing, it was actually kind of counterproductive. It would run, mine would run. I suspect probably not all of them will run. If you order one, it's like, oh, it's 65 watts, it does weird stuff. Yeah, I could get mine to do weird stuff after it had been on for about an hour or so. Because at 65 watts, the cooling solution that's in this seems to be overwhelmed by the 65 watt CPU and the 2400 megahertz RDNA 2 680M graphics, which is actually very nice. We actually have to have a whole other separate conversation about how nice the graphics actually is. However, at 45 watts, things were a much better story. And so I say that, you're sort of doing yourself a disservice, because if you run 3D Mark after the thing has been on and running for about a half an hour, 45 minutes, something like that, because, the fan's going to run kind of a lot, and you're going to get thermal throttling past 90 degrees C, at least my unit seems to do that, then when you're in that sort of thermal throttle 65 watt scenario, your game performance is also going to fall off, which is kind of rough. For the memory kit that's in here, it's 4800. 4800 is the stock performance, everything is good. But you can actually configure the BIOS to run it at 6000. But you don't have a memory kit that can load the 6000 profile. So if you need to juice the memory with extra voltage or anything like that, it doesn't work the same way that you might be used to with the gamer motherboard, where you just sort of turn that on. It does give you a couple of knobs and tunables to do that, but I don't think it really is in your best interest to buy the gamer memory and try to run it at 6000. I was able to tune the memory that I have and get it to run at 6000, but that's, again, if you're a gearhead and you like fiddling with things and you want to do stuff like that, you can get it to run at 6000. And that does positively impact the gaming performance. For, gaming performance in general, if I pluck Doom Eternal out of that, you can get another almost 10 FPS at 1080. Now, 1080? 10 FPS? More? What are we talking about? Gaming performance on this thing is actually shockingly good, probably because of RDNA 2. So with Doom Eternal, you're getting about 60 FPS at stock settings, 45 watts for the CPU. You got your 2400 megahertz RDNA 2, blah, blah, blah. 1080p low, 60 FPS on Doom Eternal on this? Really? Yeah. Really. Kind of nuts, isn't it? I know what you're wondering, but will it work with my fancy 120Hz TV? And the answer is yes, as long as you're on Adrenaline from December 16th and onward. Now, the cable quality and that sort of thing can make a big difference. Actually, the HDMI outputs on this are a little bit weak sauce. You're going to probably have to use the highest quality HDMI cables in order to get the job done, but 10-bit, YB, YCYR, 444, HDR, working great on my OLED display. And 120 hertz on an OLED from something this Lilliputian, it's very nice. Very, very nice. The integrated GPU, of course, can't keep up with that, but hey, it's not bad. I'm kind of blown away by this. I mean, this is the 6900HX. It's a mobile CPU, but GPU built in. 50, 60 FPS almost. In Doom Eternal at 1080p, medium low. I never would have thought RDNA 2 on a 6000 series CPU could get us to a reasonable gaming experience at 1080p. Doom Eternal is super optimized. It's not like that with every game, but it is very, very impressive. We got a little bit of visual glitching here, missing shadow, that kind of thing, but still, not bad. 45 FPS average on low. It's basically playable. There were a couple really minor visual glitches which may have just been down to driver issues or the game itself, but you can use Fidelity FX, you can use upscaling technologies. There is a lot of opportunity for improvement here, but again, there's no GPU in a tiny little box. This is pretty good. So we're talking about 67 to 69 FPS on Doom Eternal, as long as the thing is not thermal throttling and it's not super hot. Running the CPU at 65 watts, you will hit the thermal throttle after like 30-45 minutes. Running the CPU at 45 watts instead of 65 watts, you will hit the thermal throttle after an hour or two, and it actually seems to help a lot if you use the stand in the vertical configuration so that it can breathe a little bit better. It's a really interesting situation. For our other games and our other game performance, generally you could actually get pretty good performance at or near 1080p. Older games like GTA 5, they're going to run like butter at 1080p, which is, super impressive, even at our DDR5 4800 speed. Moving from DDR5 4800 to 6000 in synthetic benchmarks also helped significantly. Although how much it helped in game per game, it kind of varied a little bit. But it does seem to positively impact most games if you can run the memory a little bit faster. For console emulation type stuff, things like how fast was Breath of the Wild? Well, it was above 30 FPS, but it was less than 60 FPS. And it depended a little bit on your system settings and sort of how you've tuned things and blah, blah, blah. You could get really close to 60 FPS if you spend some time tuning it. But I don't really want to show too much about that. But because of the console emulation being so good for like PS3 and older, or Nintendo 64 and older, and other platforms, that's why I say I think this really makes a good media PC. I was actually curious about 4K transcoding as well. So with 4K transcoding, I could get about 2 streams with it. You see, AMD and Open Broadcaster are sort of working together with their new stuff. And also this makes things available in Plex if you're using Windows as your host operating system. For some reason I was having trouble using Plex on the Linux side of things to get everything to work just as well. But on the Windows side of things with Plex, transcoding 2 4K streams to 1080p was generally trouble-free. And I say generally trouble-free in that a couple of times some weird stuff happened, but I wasn't able to reproduce it. And that may have actually just been down to driver issues and not anything else. It probably wasn't thermal throttling either because my temperatures looked good. In normal scenarios, the thing is hovering at around 70 degrees C when heavily loaded. When it's not heavily loaded, it's, there's basically nothing there. In terms of sound and what you can expect to hear, it is audible when we're talking about more than 65 degrees C. When it's less than 65 degrees C, I was hard-pressed to even notice that it was on. It was basically silent. I mean, the fan is on, and if it's right next to your ear, okay. But if you got it set up on your desk and in the vertical configuration, basically it's fine. It's pretty much silent. If you're gaming and you have any sound at all coming from your game, you're not going to hear this tiny, tiny square of wonder. So very impressive what we are able to get out of a mobile CPU. I mean, technically the CPU launched in April, but there haven't been a ton of machines other than laptops that came out with that. And here all of a sudden there's an explosion of mini PCs and other stuff that are based around the 6900HX. And I was sort of expecting that, okay, I'm not going to be impressed by this because I've got hands-on, AM5 and all these other really high-end machines. But this machine was surprisingly snappy, very responsive, and very, very capable in gaming scenarios. So for home theater, streaming from a more powerful machine, Plex Media Server, look, check it out. 4 terabytes of storage and a 2.5-inch drive in there. Yeah, it's got a 2.5-inch drive bay in the bottom. That's not a problem. It has an NVMe slot. This one came configured with a 512 gig NVMe. Below that, you have a MediaTek Wi-Fi solution. MediaTek and AMD getting together for the amazing awesomeness. It's a Wi-Fi 6E plus Bluetooth 5.2 solution. Actually worked really well with the Bluetooth home theater speakers that I have set up. So that's really good because MediaTek is a little bit of an unknown quantity when it comes to these kinds of chipsets, mainstream and edge cases. Edge cases like Bluetooth audio. It's like, okay, it can do Wi-Fi, but what about Bluetooth devices? Does it crackle? Does weird stuff happen? Everybody out there with Bluetooth peripherals knows exactly what I'm talking about. For my use case and limited time with this machine, I've only had it like a few days. So far, so good. Knock on wood. So you may be wondering, how does this stack up against something like the new Intel NUCs, which with their Alder Lake P cores? Well, the answer, of course, is in our Geekbench scores. And if we check, yep, as expected, the Intel single-core performance is a little bit higher than what we're looking at from our AMD system. But our AMD system, with its 8 homogeneous cores, it outscores the 4+8 configuration in our Intel NUC, and at a lower power point as well. But that doesn't tell the whole story. I actually would recommend the 6900HX because we're talking about almost twice the gaming performance in some scenarios versus the Intel Xe graphics on this. So for a home theater usage scenario and less information, office worker drone. For an office worker drone, the Intel system is pretty nuts. Like even at like a low to mid tier software developer for the web, like basically just everybody but an application developer. Like, oh, I'm doing Android development. Yeah, this is probably fine. You're doing development for the web. Oh, I'm using Vue.js. Well, I've got some bad news. This i5 is probably fine for everything you're doing with its Xe graphics and everything else. But the 6900HX with RDNA 2 and that 100-watt performance, yeah, the single core score is a 6900HX single core performance. And the multi-core score, I mean, this is basically faster than a 9900KS in multi-core, a little slower, about the same in single thread, and at approximately the 45-watt TDP scenario for this, which I should point out when we're talking about running Geekbench, I'm not seeing anywhere near 90 watts at the wall for this. It's just those artificial benchmark torture tests that you can get close to 90 watts. So you still got another 30, 40 watts headroom for things like USB-C charging and everything else. So good job on the power spec minis for them. That actually works really well. So in terms of which one should I buy in terms of, Team Blue or Team Red? Team Red gives you much better integrated graphics, RDNA 2, far and away better than Xe graphics, and emulation, the whole 9 yards, works really well. But 4 P cores and 8 E cores, 12 cores in a package like this, it's really hard to beat that when you're talking about CPU-bound stuff, applications, productivity, etc., etc. The Minis Forum price is also really good. It's about $500 US for the bare bones kit. And then you can just, get the bundled memory and the bundled SSD and that kind of thing. The prices for memory and SSD is just so all over the place. It may be cheaper to get it from Minis Forum. It may be cheaper to DIY it. If you do DIY it, be aware that you're going to have to construct your own Windows 10 or Windows 11 installation USB in order to get the drivers on it. Because of the MediaTek adapter, the drivers for that are not built into Windows 11. And the 2.5 gigabit wired LAN, the drivers for that are not built into the Windows 11 installer, at least as of basically Q1 2023. Yeah, it's not a big deal to install Windows and get it up and running. So my overall thoughts on this is an incredibly powerful offering from Minis Forum. It is more of an upgrade over the 500 series, like the Minis Forum UM5. I wasn't expecting, it's a mobile CPU. I wasn't expecting this much of a performance uplift. But we've gone from Vega to RDNA 2. And for everything that I'm doing in my living room, this is really, really awesome. I really love this. Now, I've got a more powerful Plex server, 4 terabytes is not going to do it for me in something like this. But to be able to run 4 terabytes of media, plus all the console emulation you can shake a stick at, plus actually some native 1080p gaming, I mean, this is a great machine. This is a great machine for the holidays. It's a great machine to give your parents, or to have in a guest room, or to give a younger sibling, somebody that's not ready for something, that costs a lot. Well, I mean, you could probably get a used PC for less, I guess. But I digress. Overall, Minis Forum has done a really good job putting this together. It's a plastic case. It's put together, but I'm looking at the Intel. The fit and finish on the Intels may be a little better, manufacturing, quantity, that kind of thing, but there's nothing wrong with the Minis Forum build quality and fit and finish. and the details that go into this. The fan is even standard. You can order the cooling fan off of the internet should something happen. It's in the top. You got to take out a bunch of screws to get to it. But overall, not bad. And 10 gigabit USB Type-C on the front. I forgot to mention that. Fun times. Good job, Minis Forum. That's been a quick look at the UM690. And what is this level 1? I'm signing out. You can find me in the level 1 forums. Woo! Bonus round, if you want to put Linux on it, join me in the forum. It's pretty easy.